to my first YouTube channel. I will be reading Black Marxism by Cedric and while a little bit baked. So let me go take this G and I'll be right back. The foreword, Why Black Marxism, Why Now by Robin D.G. Kelly. The blues is first come from black, red, the last going out to recome, the cycle, the circle, the red, what reading did, adding, producing, revolution. Red, old, going out into black and coming back through blue, mood, indigo. Amiri Baraka. In the foreword of the first UNC Press reissue of Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, I closed with the following prediction. I have no doubt that the return of Black Marxism will have as great an impact on current and future generations of thinkers as it had on me almost 2 decades ago. I am almost confident that this time around it will reach a much larger audience and will be widely discussed in classrooms, forums, and publications that take both the past and the future seriously. Why? Because for all of its illuminating insights, bold proclamations, subtle historical correctives, and fascinating detours along paths still unexplored, Black Marxism's entire scaffolding rests on one fundamental question: where do we go from here? It is the question that produced the remarkable book in the first place, and it is the question that will bring the next generation to it. Will you hear them clouds rumbling? That was 20 years ago. As I write these words during the summer of 2020, we are witnessing the Black radical tradition in motion, driving what is arguably the most dynamic mass rebellion against state-sanctioned violence and racial capitalism we have ever seen in North America since the 1960s. Maybe the 1860s, sparked by the killing of George Perry Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and many others. Approximately 26 million people have taken to the streets to protest state-sanctioned racial violence. Some demanding that we abolish police and prisons and shift those resources to housing, universal health care, living wage jobs, universal basic income, green energy, and a system of restorative justice. The new abolitionists are not interested in making capitalism fairer, safer, and less racist. They know this is impossible. Rather, they want nothing less than to bring an end to racial capitalism. The state's reaction to rebellion has also brought us to the precipice of fascism. The organized protests, The organized protests in the streets and other places of public assembly, on campuses, inside prisons, in state houses and courtrooms and police stations portended the rise of the police state in the United States. Ooh, y'all, I gotta sneeze. Ooh. For the past several years, the movement for Black Lives and its dozens of allied organizations warned the country that unless we end racist, state-sanctioned violence and the mass caging of Black and brown people, we are headed for a fascist state. They issued these warnings before Trump's election, but standing here in 2020 as armed white militia gunned down protesters as the current regime threatens to hold on to a power regardless of the outcome of the presidential election, as the federal the federal government deploys armed forces. Sometimes when I read a little too fast before my mouth is able to talk, armed force to suppress dissent, rounds up and deports undocumented workers, and intimidates the public, it is easy to conclude that fascism is already here. The crossroads where Black revolt and fascism meet is precisely the space where Cedric's main interlocutors find the Black radical tradition. Black Marxism is, in part, about an earlier generation of Black anti-fascists, written at the dawn of a global right-wing neoliberal order that led one political theorist to call it the era of friendly fascism. In 1893, the same year Black Marxism came out, Cedric published a brilliant essay on fascism that not only exposed U.S. capitalist support for Mussolini, but argued that the Black masses anticipated and resisted the rise of fascism long before it was considered a crisis. Robinson called them premature anti-fascists, who stood in stark opposition to the elites who gave primacy to the interests of the state as an instrument of racial destiny. Nearly 3 decades of movement building, scholarship, and political education explain why so many people can even say the words defund the police, prison abolition, or racial capitalism, we would not be here for this critical we would not be here if not for the critical resistance the Labor Community Strategy Center, Project South, Organization for Black Struggle, in parentheses St. Louis, Power, People Organized to Win Employment Rights, Southerners on New Ground Song, Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, Sister to Sister, the African American Policy Reform, the Black Radical Congress, the Los Angeles Community Action Network, Miami Workers Center, the Praxis Project, Fierce, Fabulous, Independent, Educated, Radicals for Community Empowerment, Queers for Economic Justice, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, SRLP, Reverend Jackson's, Reverend William J. Barber's Moral Mondays movement and New Poor People's Campaign, Cooperation Jackson. See, that's where I was getting. Did I say Jackson? In Mississippi, the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, the Free Alabama Movement, and Showing Up for Racial Justice, SURJ. We would not be here without Angela Davis's Our Prisons Obsolete and Abolition Democracy, or Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, or the abolitionists and anti-capitalists writing for Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Marima Kaba and others, the murderers of Trayvon Martin, Rekia Boyd, Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, John Crawford III, Alton Sterling, Walter Scott, and so many others spawned a wave of Black radical organizing, notably Black Lives Matter, the Dream Defenders, Black Youth Project 100, We Charge Genocide, Bold, Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity, Hands Up United, Lost Voices, Millennial Activists United, Million Hoodies Movement for Justice, Destiny and Power, Now, Ella's Daughters, Asada's Daughters, Black Feminist Future Project, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, Let Us Breathe Collective, the Movement for Black Lives, the Majority, and Scholars for Social Justice, among others. All of these movements and thinkers have, at one time or another, engaged, embraced, or were influenced by Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism. Two key concepts: racial capitalism and the Black radical tradition, introduced in these pages almost 40 years ago, have become a common part of our shared political language. His ideas have taken hold in activist circles and in the academy since the appearance of the 2000 edition, as well as the publication of Robinson's Black Movements in America. We should get these books. Let me just put a little note. You know the vibes. Published in 1997, and Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, Blacks and the Regime of Race in American Theater and Film Before World War II, published in 2007. Cedric's untimely passing on June 5, 2016, followed by the reissue of The Terms of Order, Political Science, and the Myth of Leadership in 2016, an Anthropology of Marxism in 2019, and the recent publication of On Racial Capitalism, Black Internationalism, and Cultures of Resistance, published in 2019, edited and with an introduction by H.L.T. Kwan, have inspired a generation to finally recognize Cedric Robinson as one of the most important intellectuals of our era. Since 2004, Cedric's life and work have been the subject of dozens of conferences, symposia, forums, and panels in countless university courses, not just in the United States, but around the world. And scholarship building on and critically engaging his work, especially Black Marxism, have ballooned since I made note of the very fact 20 years ago that the book garnered no major reviews and very little notice in scholarly publications. Even more consequential is the extent to which Cedric's ideas have influenced the struggle on the ground. The Movement for Black Lives, a coalition made up of more than 150 organizations, built much of its social justice agenda around the critique of racial capitalism. Its widely publicized statement, A Vision for Black Lives, Policy Demands for Black Power, Freedom, and Justice, which it rolled out 2 months after Cedric passed, identified how the combination of slavery, America's deep-rooted system of racial capitalism, and long-lasting discriminatory institutions have for centuries denied Black people equal access to the wealth created through their labor. Racial capitalism's driving force was not the invisible hand of the market, but the visible fist of state-sanctioned violence, which is why the statement framed ongoing processes of extraction, dispossession, and subjugation as a war on black people. By calling for an end to the war on black people, here and abroad, and the reinvestment of resources from the carceral to military state to from the carceral and military state to education, health, and safety, creating a just, democratically controlled economy, the Movement for Black Lives effectively presents a plan to transform the entire nation, save the planet, and ultimately end racial capitalism. The political theorist Sadat Issar made the trenchant observation that the policy statement for the Movement of Black Lives explicitly names racial capitalism in order to expose and politicize the fact that the capitalist economy is constituted by a racial logic. The need to politicize the link between capitalism and racial domination is itself a response to how this link has been depoliticized and concealed by liberal and influential left theorists of capitalism. Think about like colorblind. We gotta be colorblind. I had to write that down so we can come back to that. Reckoning with racial capitalism. Reckoning with racial capitalism. Cedric Robinson did not coin the term racial capitalism. The phrase originated in South Africa around 1976 with the publication of a short paper titled Foreign Investment and the Reproduction of Racial Capitalism in South Africa by Martin Legasik and David Hempson, white South Africans affiliated with the African National Congress, ANC. Ooh, someone got found guilty. But I don't even know what that means in terms of whatever. Sorry, distracted. The authors were not proposing a theory of racial capitalism so much as critiquing the liberal belief that the flow of still that theme of like, you can't be colorblind because we live in color, right? Critiquing the liberal belief that the flow of international capital can potentially subvert the apartheid state and replace it with normative, efficient capitalist relations in a multiracial democracy. Their paper implied that dismantling apartheid without overthrowing capitalism would leave in place structures that reproduce racial inequality and the exploitation of all workers. Cedric took the phrase racial capitalism much further, developing it from a description to a specific system to a framework for understanding the global history of capitalism. Racial capitalism has been the subject of a robust body of scholarship and has been, I hate when I do that, has become virtually a field unto itself since the republication of Black Marxism. In fact, the term has become so commonplace in left circles that when the neo-Marxist philosopher Michael Walzer confessed his ignorance of racial capitalism in the pages of Dissent, social media lit up, shaming and schooling the professor for being a political and theoretical Luddite. Walzer's response, however, is typical of a number of leading Marxist thinkers who have dismissed as insufficiently anti-capitalist the decade-long uprising against state-sanctioned racialized violence, mass criminalization, political disenfranchisement, deportation, pipeline expansion, and starvation wages for fast food and service workers. Racism, like heteropatriarchy, they argue is not constitutive of capitalism, but operates alongside capitalism. They like this, parallel, kissing and canoodling, an added irritant, as it were, to oppress particular subgroups and divide the working class. When Alex Doublet questioned the Marxist geographer David Harvey for ignoring or sidelining racialization in the historical and material story of capitalism, especially since the most intense mobilizations in the United States against the capitalist order were aimed at anti-Black police violence, Harvey replied that race was simply not a part of the logic of capital accumulation. There was nothing inherently anti-capitalist about anti-racism, he wrote, adding, I don't see the current struggles in Ferguson as dealing very much in anti-capitalism. Similarly, in a short essay published 6 months after Cedric's death, Walter Ben Michaels declared, "It's not racism that creates the differences between classes, it's capitalism. And it's not anti-racism that can combat the difference, it's socialism. You don't build the left by figuring out which victim has been most victimized, you build it by organizing all the victims." When it comes to the value of universal health care, for example, we don't need to worry for a second about whether the black descendants of slaves are worse off than the white descendants of coal miners. The goal is to make sure that the black people are no sicker than the white people and make everybody healthy. Just to be clear, to insist that capitalism has always operated within a system and ideology that assigns differential value to human life and labor does not mean that hiring black cops or incorporating black elites into the existing power structure will hasten racial capitalism's demise or bring us closer to achieving a pure colorblind capitalism. Got y'all over on this side. Cedric Robinson never subscribed to this idea, and the movements who find inspiration in his work certainly don't believe it. So Walter, Ben Michaels, Harvey, and others are not only attacking straw people, but also failing to grasp how the logics of racism fundamentally shape both capital accumulation and the role of the state. We know, for example, that black people around North St. Louis County took to the streets of Ferguson not only to demand justice for Michael Brown Jr., but also to protest a predatory system of policing that used citations, fees, fines, and arrest warrants to extract millions of dollars from mostly poor, black, over-policed communities while extending generous tax abatements to corporations, stripping public schools and essential services for much-needed revenue. And they were fighting for the basic right not to be beaten, tortured, or unalived by the police. I don't know what I can say and not say yet, so whose raison d'etre, R-A-I-S-O-N-D with apostrophe E with the caret T-R-E, is to protect property and maintain order. Their job. We know that universal health care, a fundamental long-standing demand for the Black freedom movement, will not by itself magically abolish the conditions that produce racialized health inequalities, nor will it guarantee equal, bias-free treatment for patients. Just on a descriptive level, we can plainly see that capitalism does not operate from a purely colorblind market logic, but through the ideology of white supremacy. We see it in the history of the policing of black and brown communities, land dispossession, displacement, predatory lending, taxation, disenfranchisement, the environmental catastrophe, in racial differences in wages and employment opportunities, in depressed black home values, in the exclusion of black people from better schools and public accommodations for which they taxed, and in the extraction of black labor and resources to subsidize white wealth accumulation. And we recognize a neoliberal variant of racial capitalism that involves dismantling the welfare state, promoting capital flight, privatizing public schools, hospitals, housing, transits, and other public resources, and the massive growth of police and prisons. These policies have produced scarcity, poverty, alternative, in parentheses, illegal economies regulated through violence and environmental and health hazards. Cedric revealed exactly how racial capitalism creates the differences between classes and why anti-racism is fundamental to combat these differences. He begins by dismissing the myth that capitalism was the great modernizer giving birth to the proletariat as the universal class. Instead, he writes, the dialect of proletarization disciplined the working class into the importance of distinctions between ethnics and nationalities, between skilled and unskilled workers, and between races. The persistence and creation of such oppositions within the working class were a critical aspect of the triumph of capitalism in the 19th century. Just as the Irish were products of very different popular trends born and bred under colonialism, The English working class was formed by Anglo-Saxon chauvinism, a racial ideology shared across class lines that allowed the English bourgeoisie to rationalize low wages and mistreatment for the Irish. Building on the work of the black radical sociologist Oliver Cox, Robinson challenges the Marxist idea that capitalism was a revolutionary negation of feudalism. Instead, he argues capitalism emerged within the feudal order and flowered in the cultural soil of a Western civilization already thoroughly infused with racialism. Robinson does not argue that the modern racism originating in the 17th century was the same thing. Rather, he argues that hierarchies based on constructed, racialized differences were already in place prior to the emergence of capitalism. Capitalism was racial, not because of some conspiracy to divide workers or to justify slavery and dispossession, but because racialism had already permeated Western feudal society. The first European proletarians were racial subjects: Irish, Jews, Roma, slaves, Slavs, etc., and they were victims of dispossession and enclosure, colonialism, and slavery within Europe. Indeed, Robinson suggests that racialization within Europe was very much a colonial process involving invasion, settlement, expropriation, and racial hierarchy. Insisting that modern, let me put an underline for a definition word. Insisting that modern European nationalism was completely bound up with the racialist myths, he reminded us of the ideology of Herrenvolk, governance by an ethnic majority, that drove German colonization of Central Europe and the Slavic territories, explained in the inevitability and the naturalness of the domination of some Europeans by other Europeans. To acknowledge this is not to diminish anti-black racism or African slavery, but rather to recognize that capitalism was not the great modernizer giving birth to the European proletariat as a universal subject, and that the tendency of the European civilization through capitalism was thus not to homogenize, but to differentiate, to exaggerate regional, subcultural, and dialectical differences into racial ones. The consequences explained by Ben Michael's injunction to build the left by organizing all the victims is easier said than done. Cedric began Black Marxism in Europe precisely to ask the perennial question that too many traditional Marxists avoid. Why have white workers continually failed to recognize and embrace Black, Brown, Asian, and Indigenous working people as a part of their class? What explains the overwhelming participation of white workers in anti-Black mob violence and racial pogroms, or their fierce defense of segregated neighborhoods and schools, or their reluctance to join picket lines in defense of Black workers? Black Marxism explains that Marx and Engels knew but were unwilling to come to terms with ideologies of racial difference, and to a lesser extent individualism fractured the proletariat. It was and is hardly a universal subject. The development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society, Cedric writes, pursued essentially racial directions. So too did social ideology. As a material force, then, it could be expected that racialism would inevitably permeate the social structures emergent from capitalism. At the same time, he does not argue that racial antagonisms between differentiated categories of workers are fixed or immutable, nor does he foreclose those genuine moments of solidarity. The examples he found in W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, or in the fugitive gatherings of escaped Africans, white bondsmen, and indigenous communities. On the contrary, he refutes the very idea of a unified white caste as the natural order of things. Natural is italicized. He recognized well before whiteness studies evolved into the academic pursuit, the fragility of white supremacy, racial capitalism's survival depended not only on the violent subjugation of African and indigenous people, but on keeping whites in line as a means of obliterating these events. The myth of white solidarity arose and came to dominate American sensibility. It was for the most part a lie, but a terribly seductive one. By the end of the 19th century, it had already substantially displaced the past and mystified the relations of the day. It remains in place.